Jesus taught Mary Magdalene a ritual, a specific, deliberate, step-by-step transmission for entering the monad, the absolute source of all existence. He did not teach this to the 12 disciples. He did not teach it in the synagogues. He did not teach it in the open air to the crowds who followed him for miracles and parables. He taught it privately, intimately, to her. And the church erased it, not accidentally, not through the ordinary loss of time and translation. Deliberately, systematically, with full awareness of what they were removing and exactly why it had to go. That erasure is what you and I are going to undo today. Now I want you to sit with something for a moment before we go any further. Think about what it means for a teaching to be erased. Not lost, erased. There is a profound difference between something that fades because nobody cared about it and something that gets actively, carefully removed. Lost things are forgotten. Erased things are remembered by someone who decided you should not have access to them. The erasure itself is the confession. It tells you, without a single word of explanation, that whatever was removed was considered dangerous, real, effective, threatening enough to justify the effort of making it disappear. That is the first thing I want you to hold on to as we move through this together. The fact that this teaching was erased is not evidence against it. It is evidence for it. I have spent years sitting with this material, years reading, questioning, pulling threads, following the teaching wherever it led, even when it took me somewhere uncomfortable. And I want to be honest with you from the beginning. What I found did not shake my appreciation for Jesus. It deepened it, because the Jesus who emerges from the hidden teachings is not smaller than the one you were handed in Sunday school. He is vastly, almost incomprehensibly larger, more precise, more radical, more extraordinary. The Jesus of the official story performed miracles and died for sins. The Jesus of the hidden transmission was doing something that makes miracles look like a warm-up act. He was teaching human beings how to dissolve the boundary between themselves and the absolute source of all creation, through 5 precise inner initiations he called the seals, and through a specific sound that has been hiding in plain sight inside religious practice for 2,000 years. That is what the ritual was for, and Mary Magdalene was the one he trusted to receive it fully, to understand it completely, and to carry it forward after he was gone. So what exactly is the monad? What were the 5 seals? What did Jesus actually say to her when they were alone, when the other disciples were not present, when the teaching could finally be given in its full and undiluted form? What was the sound, the vibrational practice, that formed the physical core of the ritual? And why, specifically, did the early church consider all of this so dangerous that they spent centuries trying to make sure you would never hear it? By the time this video ends, you're going to have answers to every single one of those questions. Not academic answers. Not distant, theoretical, intellectual answers. Living answers. The kind that land in your chest and stay there. But before I take you into the ritual itself, before I walk you through what Jesus actually said to Mary Magdalene in those private hours of transmission, you need to understand who she really was. Because the church spent 1,500 years telling you a story about Mary Magdalene that was not only wrong. It was a calculated lie designed specifically to discredit everything she represented. And once you see what she actually represented, once you understand her real role in the teaching, everything else is going to fall into place. There is a particular kind of aloneness that comes with understanding something deeply that the people around you cannot yet see. You are in the same room. You are hearing the same words. But something is landing in you differently, going deeper, connecting to something in you that the same words are not yet touching in them. It is not arrogance. It is not superiority. It is just a different readiness, a different preparation, something already cleared inside you that has not yet been cleared in them. That was Mary Magdalene's position among the disciples of Jesus. She was not a prostitute. Let me be very direct about that, because 15 centuries of deliberate slander deserve a very direct correction. The identification of Mary Magdalene as a sinful woman, as a prostitute, as the woman caught in adultery, none of that appears anywhere in the earliest texts. It was constructed, assembled piece by piece from the deliberate merging of several different women mentioned in the early accounts, women who had nothing to do with each other, into a single composite figure of female shame. And the man who made that construction official was Pope Gregory I, in a sermon delivered in 591 CE. He stood before his congregation and announced that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinful woman of Luke chapter 7 were all the same person. They were not. He knew they were not. And with that single sermon, he successfully buried the most important figure in the inner transmission of Jesus's teaching under layers of shame and sexual scandal that would take the next 1400 years to excavate. Why would the church do that? Why would the erasure of Mary Magdalene's real identity be worth that much institutional effort? Because of what she actually was. In 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi. His mattock struck something hard beneath the surface. He pulled out a large sealed ceramic jar. He almost didn't open it. There was a local belief that jars like this sometimes contained spirits. But curiosity or fate, or something older than both, made him break the seal. Inside were 13 leather-bound books, papyrus codices, texts that had been hidden in that jar sometime in the late 4th century, hidden by someone who knew that the wrong people were coming, that the burning was beginning, that these words had to be buried to survive. Those texts, now known as the Nag Hammadi Library, changed everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. And running through many of them, like a thread of gold through dark fabric, was a consistent and unmistakable picture of Mary Magdalene's real role. She was called the companion of Jesus, a word whose original meaning carried the weight of the deepest possible intimacy, the kind of closeness that is not physical but metaphysical. She was the one who understood what Jesus said when the others did not. She was the one Jesus turned to when he needed to transmit the deepest layers of the teaching, because she was the only one with the inner clarity to receive them. She was, in the words of one of the most significant of those buried texts, the one who knew the all. The title she eventually carried, Apostle to the Apostles, is usually treated as a polite honorific. A nice thing to say about a woman who was present at the resurrection. But in esoteric terms, that title is a precise functional description. An apostle is one who is sent, one who carries the teaching forward. To be the apostle to the apostles means that she was the source from which the apostles themselves received something. She was upstream of them. She was the transmission point, not the receiver. And Peter knew it. That tension between Peter and Mary Magdalene, which shows up across multiple early texts, and which the church has always tried to frame as a simple personality conflict, was not about personalities. It was about lineage. It was about who carried the real teaching and who carried the institutional version. Peter represents the outer church, the structure, the hierarchy, the publicly transmitted doctrine. Mary represents the inner transmission, the direct, unmediated, dangerous path to the monad that Jesus entrusted specifically to her. Peter wins historically. He builds the institution. He gets the keys. His lineage becomes the Roman Catholic Church. But Mary's teaching survives, hidden, buried in jars, passed in whispers through the Gnostic communities, through the desert mystics, through lines of transmission that kept their heads down and their mouths mostly shut. It survives because what Jesus gave her was not a text. It was a living transmission, and living things are much harder to kill than written ones. Now, I personally believe, and I want to be clear this is my own conviction shaped by years of sitting with this material, that Mary was chosen not because Jesus had favorites, not because of any personal relationship separate from the teaching, but because she had done something internally that the male disciples had not yet done. She had cleared a particular obstruction in herself, a willingness to be fully seen, fully undone, fully remade by the teaching. The male disciples, even the most devoted among them, carried a certain resistance, a certain investment in their own identity, their own understanding, their own position in the story. Mary had released that, and that release, that inner spaciousness, is exactly what made the deepest transmission possible. Jesus needed somewhere for the teaching to land fully. She was that somewhere. But here is the thing. What he was transmitting to her was not just knowledge about the monad. It was a path to it, a ritual, a precise inner technology for dissolving the veils that separate human consciousness from the absolute source. And before I can take you inside that ritual, before I can walk you through what Jesus actually said to her, you need to understand what the monad actually is. Because the word gets used constantly in spiritual content and almost never explained in a way that actually lands. I'm going to explain it in a way that lands. Try to look directly at the sun. Go ahead, try it in your mind. The moment you turn your full gaze toward it, it overwhelms you. It is too much, too bright, too total. You have to look sideways. You have to approach it indirectly, catch it at the edges of your vision, let your eyes adjust gradually. You cannot take it head on. That is what it is like to try to think about the monad. Not because the monad is complicated, not because it requires advanced philosophical training, but because the monad is the thing your thinking is made of, and the eye cannot see itself. The tool cannot examine the hand that holds it. The mind cannot think the thing that thinking arises from. So let me come at this sideways. Let me approach it the way it has to be approached. The word monad comes from the Greek word meaning the one. But here is where people immediately go wrong. They hear the one, and they picture a very large, very powerful being. A god on a throne, an infinite version of a person, the greatest thing in a universe full of things. That is not the monad. That is still a thing, still an object, still something that can be pointed at from the outside. The monad is not a thing. It is the ground from which all things arise. It is not a being among beings. It is the source from which all being flows. It is not even consciousness in the way you usually think of consciousness, a mind that is aware of things. It is the awareness itself, before it becomes aware of anything in particular. Pure, undivided, contentless presence. The silence that exists before the first sound. The darkness that is not the absence of light, but the fullness that has not yet divided itself into light and dark. In the ancient mystery schools, the traditions that preceded Christianity, and that Jesus almost certainly encountered during his years in Egypt, the monad was described as the ineffable one. Ineffable meaning, literally cannot be spoken. Not because it is beyond language in the way a complicated idea might be beyond a child's vocabulary, but because language is always the naming of differences, this and not that, here and not there, now and not then. And the monad has no differences, no edges, no inside and outside, no before or after. It is the one reality from which all apparent differences are projected, the way a single light source projects countless shadows that appear to be separate objects. Now Jesus knew this, deeply, precisely, and when he spoke in public, when he addressed the crowds, he used accessible language. He said Father. He spoke of God as a loving parent, as a shepherd, as a keeper of the lost and the broken. That language was real. It was not wrong, but it was the outer teaching, the map given to those who were not yet ready for the territory. In private, with Mary Magdalene, he spoke differently. The Father Jesus pointed to in the inner teaching was not a being. It was the monad. It was the absolute source that exists prior to all creation, including the creation described in Genesis. And this is where one of the most radical and deliberately suppressed teachings of early Gnostic Christianity enters the picture: the distinction between the monad and the demiurge. The demiurge. The word means craftsman or maker. In the inner teaching, the demiurge is the lesser creative force, not the monad itself, but an emanation from it, who constructs the material world. The physical universe, with all its beauty and all its suffering, all its density and limitation, is the demiurge's workshop. It is real. It is not evil exactly, but it is not the highest reality. It is downstream. It is the shadow, not the light. The god of rules and punishments. The God who demands sacrifice and obedience. The God who gets angry and floods the earth and requires blood atonement. That, in the inner teaching, is the demiurge. A real force, a powerful force, but not the monad, not the true source. And you can begin to feel immediately why this was dangerous. Because the entire structure of institutional religion, all of it, not just Christianity, is built on the demiurge. On an external God who requires mediation, who must be appeased, who requires priests and rituals and buildings and hierarchies between the human and the divine. If the true source, the monad, is not external at all, if it is the ground of your own being, if it is what you already are beneath all the layers of identity and belief and story, if you can reach it directly through a specific inner practice that requires no intermediary, then what does the institution become? What is the priest for? What is the building for? What is the hierarchy for? Nothing. That is what the Church was protecting against. Not heresy in the abstract. This specific, concrete, undeniable implication of the teaching Jesus gave Mary Magdalene. I want to say something here from my own experience of sitting with this teaching. The first time I genuinely understood the distinction between the monad and the demiurge, not as a philosophical idea, but as something that landed in my actual experience of what God means. It felt like a pressure releasing. Like something I had been carrying without knowing I was carrying it suddenly became lighter. Because the God I had been unconsciously relating to, even as someone who considered myself spiritually open, was still the demiurge. Still an external judge. Still something I needed to earn access to. And the monad is nothing like that. The monad is not judging you. It is not withholding itself. It is not at a distance. It is the depth of what you are, right now, beneath everything you think you are. The ritual Jesus taught Mary Magdalene was the path to that depth, and it began with understanding why it had to be hidden. There is a particular weight that comes with carrying something that cannot be spoken openly. You feel it in the body, a slight pressure, a careful calibration of what you say and to whom and how much. You choose your words not because you are ashamed of what you know, but because you are aware of what it costs to say it in the wrong room to the wrong ears. You learn to speak in layers. Outer meaning for those who are not ready. Inner meaning for those who are. Jesus worked this way deliberately. It was not concealment for its own sake. It was precision. He taught in parables to the public, stories with multiple layers of meaning, the surface accessible to anyone, the depth only visible to those who already had the inner preparation to receive it. To the disciples, he explained the parables. To the inner circle, he went further. And to Mary Magdalene, he went all the way. This was the ancient pattern of the mystery schools, and it was not unique to Jesus. Every major initiatory tradition in the ancient world, Egyptian, Pythagorean, Eleusinian, Hermetic, operated on the same principle. There is an outer teaching for the many and an inner teaching for the few. Not because the few are more worthy as human beings, but because the inner teaching, transmitted to someone not yet prepared for it, does not enlighten them. It destabilizes them. It blows open doors they have no framework to walk through safely. The bridal chamber, one of the most discussed and most misunderstood concepts in the inner Christian tradition, was the name given to the space and the practice in which the highest transmission took place. The Church has done everything in its power to keep that phrase sounding like a metaphor for conventional marriage, or at most a spiritual allegory for the soul's union with God in the most abstract sense. It is neither of those things. The bridal chamber was a specific initiatory practice, a specific inner technology. The name points to what happens inside the practice, a marriage, but not between two people, between the two poles of consciousness within a single human being. We will come back to this in full when we are inside the ritual itself. Now consider the alabaster jar. Consider the anointing. The image of Mary Magdalene with the alabaster jar of oil, anointing Jesus, pouring the oil over his head or his feet, filling the room with fragrance. This image has been sentimentalized into something personal and emotional. A woman expressing devotion, love, gratitude. And while the love was real, if you read the act esoterically, if you read it through the lens of the mystery school tradition Jesus and Mary were operating within, you see something completely different. The chrism, the sacred oil. In the ancient initiatory traditions, the anointing with oil was the outer physical enactment of an inner spiritual event, the awakening of the anointed consciousness. The word Christ itself does not mean Jesus' last name. It means the anointed one, the one whose consciousness has been sealed, activated, prepared for the highest transmission. When Mary anoints Jesus, she is not just a student honoring a teacher. In the esoteric reading, she is a fully initiated practitioner enacting the anointing ritual, recognizing and sealing his completed consciousness. She is acting as a priest, as an equal, as someone who understands precisely what she is doing and why. That reading of the anointing scene was absolutely threatening to the early church hierarchy, because it placed Mary Magdalene in a position of initiatory authority over Jesus. Not above him, but alongside him, as a peer in the transmission, as someone whose spiritual understanding was fully activated and operational. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is usually discussed in terms of the decision about the nature of Christ, human, divine, or both. But what happened at Nicaea and in the decades around it was far broader than that single doctrinal question. It was the systematic canonization of a particular version of Christianity and the systematic destruction of every other version. Texts were condemned. Communities were labeled heretical, and the specific strand of teaching that carried the inner transmission, the direct path to the monad, the 5 seals, the bridal chamber practice, was targeted with particular force. I do not believe this was purely about power, though power was certainly part of it. I think there was also genuine fear. Fear of what happens when ordinary people, not just trained monastics, not just ordained clergy, but ordinary women and men, begin to actually reach the monad directly. Begin to experience for themselves that the true source is not outside them, not above them, not accessible only through institutional mediation. That experience, once it spreads, cannot be controlled, cannot be taxed, cannot be organized into a hierarchy. It is inherently, structurally ungovernable. An ungovernable spiritual experience is the one thing an institution cannot survive. So the ritual had to go. The texts had to be buried or burned. Mary Magdalene had to be turned from the apostle to the apostles, the living carrier of the deepest transmission, into a weeping, repentant sinner at the feet of the real teachers. But the ritual itself, what Jesus actually said to Mary, what he actually showed her, what he actually walked her through in those private hours of transmission, that did not disappear. It was too alive, too woven into the fabric of human consciousness itself to be fully removed. And now I am going to take you inside it. He does not begin with instruction. That is the first thing you need to understand about the way Jesus teaches in the inner transmission. He does not open with doctrine or explanation. He opens with a question. They are alone. The other disciples are not present. Whatever the specific setting, a room, a garden, a quiet place set apart from the movement and noise of the ministry, the quality of the space is particular. There is a stillness that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Something waiting. Jesus looks at Mary Magdalene and he asks her, "What do you think you are? Not who are you? What are you?" The distinction is precise and deliberate. Who invites a name, a role, a story? What goes deeper? What is the nature of the thing that calls itself Mary? What is the substance of it? What are its actual edges? Mary is not a beginner at this point. She has been with the teaching long enough, has sat in the presence of this transmission long enough, to know that the question is not casual. She understands that she is being asked to look, not to answer with words, but to actually turn her attention toward the thing that is usually looking outward and direct it inward instead. And what she finds first, what anyone finds first when they turn this kind of attention on themselves, is the body. This is the first seal. Jesus teaches her, "You believe you are this." He does not gesture dismissively at the physical form. He does not teach that the body is evil, that matter is a prison, that the physical world is something to be escaped and despised. That is a distortion that crept into certain Gnostic lineages, and it is not the teaching here. The body is real, matter is real, but the body is a garment. It is what consciousness is wearing in this particular expression of existence. It is not what consciousness is. The first seal is the layer of identity built on the physical. I am this body, I am this face, I am this gender, this age, this set of sensations. It is the most obvious layer of self, the one we are taught to identify with from the first moment of life. And Jesus teaches Mary to look at it clearly, not to reject it, not to punish it, to see it accurately, as something worn, not something that is wearing you. Mary sits with this, and something in her, some place of habitual identification with the form, begins to loosen. Just slightly, just enough. Jesus moves immediately to the second layer, because when you loosen the grip of physical identity, what rises to the surface is the emotional body. The field of desire and aversion, longing and fear, attachment and resistance that operates just beneath the skin. This is the second seal. Now you feel this, Jesus says to her. The wanting, the fearing, the reaching toward some things and pulling back from others. You believe this movement is you. He is not teaching her to suppress the emotions. He is not teaching spiritual bypass, the practice of floating above feeling in the name of transcendence. He is teaching her to see the emotional nature as a movement, a wave, a current passing through the space of awareness. Not the awareness itself, not the one who is aware, a pattern arising in awareness, like weather arising in the sky. The sky is not the weather. The sky does not become the storm. It holds the storm without being the storm. This teaching, just the second seal alone, is something that most people spend decades of spiritual practice circling around without ever landing on this precisely. Jesus gives it to Mary directly, cleanly, without cushioning, and Mary receives it. Something begins to shift in her face, in the quality of her presence. The teaching is not just being heard, it is landing. Now Jesus pauses. He watches her. There is a quality of attention in him that is not ordinary human attention. It is as if he can see exactly where she is in the inner landscape, exactly where the next edge is, exactly what is needed in this precise moment. And then he turns to the third seal. But there is something even more stubborn than the body or the feelings, he says to her. There is the one who interprets, the one who names everything, the one who says, this is what that means, this is what that experience was, this is how to understand what just happened. This one, you believe, is the most truly you of all, the thinking mind, the interpreter, the meaning maker. This is the third seal, the mental identity. The layer of self that is constructed entirely out of concepts, narratives, interpretations, and beliefs. The one that is always running, always processing, always turning raw experience into a story about experience. And crucially, the one that is convinced it is close to the truth. Convinced it is getting nearer and nearer to understanding. Convinced that with enough thinking, enough reading, enough spiritual study, it will eventually think its way to God. Jesus teaches Mary something about this layer that I believe is among the most radical things he ever said in the inner transmission. He teaches her that the thinking mind cannot reach the monad, not because it is not advanced enough, not because it needs more refinement or more training, but because thinking is always a movement away from stillness. And the monad is stillness itself. Every thought, even the most elevated, the most spiritually sophisticated, the most luminously wise, is a wave on the surface of water. And the monad is the water, the depth beneath every wave, the place where there is no more surface. He uses an image with her, water going quiet, a bowl of disturbed water, all the ripples and waves and the surface patterns of movement. And then stillness, not forced stillness, not the stillness of water that has been commanded to stop moving, the natural stillness that emerges when the disturbing force is simply removed. When the interpretations stop being generated, when the naming ceases, what is left? Something that was always there beneath the movement. Something that the movement was obscuring not by covering it, but simply by being more immediately noticeable than it. Mary sits with the third seal, and what begins to happen in her is not comfortable. Because the thinking mind, particularly the spiritually trained thinking mind, does not release its grip willingly. It begins to generate its own response to the teaching. It begins to interpret the teaching about interpretation. It becomes very thoughtfully interested in the concept of going beyond thought. And Jesus sees this happening, and he is quiet. He does not rush in to fix it. He lets her feel the shape of it, the way the mind recurses, turns back on itself, uses every new teaching as fresh material to process and incorporate into the existing story about who she is. He waits, and eventually, the recursion exhausts itself. The mind runs out of new angles, and in that moment of exhaustion, something opens. Just slightly. Just a crack, just enough to glimpse what is on the other side of the third seal. And what she glimpses there is enough to make her understand why she needs to keep going. There are two more, Jesus says to her quietly. And these are the ones the world is not ready to hear. The first three seals address the layers that every serious spiritual tradition eventually teaches the student to examine. The body, the emotions, the thinking mind. Every genuine tradition, every one, eventually points at these three layers and says, "You are not this. You are the awareness in which these arise." But then most traditions stop there. They point to awareness as the destination. They say, rest as the witness. Rest as pure consciousness. Abide as the one who is aware. And this is genuinely transformative. Do not misunderstand me. Touching that level of inner clarity changes a person. But in the transmission Jesus gave Mary Magdalene, awareness is not the destination. It is the fourth layer. It is the fourth seal. And it has to be passed through, not rested in. You have found the witness, Jesus says to her, when she reports what she is discovering in her inner inquiry. The one who watches the body, watches the feelings, watches the thoughts. You believe this witness is your truest self, your soul, your deepest nature. Mary is quiet for a moment, and then she says something that reveals exactly how far she has come and exactly where the next edge is. She says, in essence, yes. This witnessing presence, this is what I am. This is what remains when everything else is released. And Jesus looks at her with a particular quality of attention, not unkind, not impatient, but utterly uncompromising. And he says, whose story is that? The fourth seal, the soul's narrative, the spiritual autobiography. I am the one who awakened. I am the one who has journeyed. I am the one who is finding the path, moving toward the light, deepening in awareness, approaching God. Even the most advanced spiritual identity, the witness, the soul, the awakened consciousness, is still a story, still a shape that awareness has taken, still something that arose in the monad rather than being the monad itself. This is the teaching that breaks people, not because it is unkind, because it is so precise, because it lands exactly on the place where the spiritual seeker has been secretly, quietly investing their deepest sense of self. The journey itself, the fact of being a person who is on the path, the progress, the growing clarity. the expanding awareness. All of it, Jesus teaches Mary, all of it is still the self, still the fourth seal, still the veil. And here is the thing about Mary that makes her extraordinary. She does not argue. She does not defend the witness. She does not produce a sophisticated spiritual counterargument. She feels the truth of what he is pointing at, and she allows it to dismantle her. This is why she was chosen, not because she was better, because she was willing to be undone more completely than the others. She sits in what I can only describe as a kind of freefall. The body, not that. The emotions, not that. The thinking mind, not that. The witnessing soul, not that either. Then what? What is left? Is there anything? Jesus does not rush to fill the silence. He knows exactly what is happening. He has been here himself. He allows her to stay in the freefall long enough for the freefall itself to become familiar. Long enough for the terror of having nothing left to identify with to begin to transmute into something else. Into a quality of openness that is not emptiness, but is instead a fullness so complete it has no shape. And then he speaks again. There is one more veil, he says. The subtlest of all. The hardest to see because it wears the face of arrival. The fifth seal. The sense of being a separate spiritual self. Even beyond the witness. Even beyond the soul's narrative. There is still, at the very bottom of the self-structure, a sense of existing as a distinct point of awareness. A sense of being here rather than there. Of being this rather than that. An ultimate feeling of, I am. Separate. Individual. Bounded. Even if those bounds are very subtle, very refined, barely perceptible, they are still there. Still the last veil between the personal self and the monad. Jesus teaches Mary that this fifth seal is the most dangerous not because it is the most solid, but because it is the most convincing. It has survived the dissolution of every other layer. It feels like the truth. It feels like the real self, finally uncovered. And the mind, even a mind as clear and prepared as Mary's at this point, wants to stop here. Wants to call this arrival. Wants to say, I have found it. I am awareness. I am the witness. I am pure presence. This is the monad. It is not the monad. It is the last self. The most refined, the most spiritual, the most luminous, but still a self. Still a something that can be distinguished from the absolute. And how? Mary asks him. How does this last veil open? This is the moment in the teaching where Jesus introduces the concept that the Church found most threatening of all. Because the answer to Mary's question is not a technique. It is not a practice in the ordinary sense. It is a recognition. Within you, Jesus says, there are two principles, two poles of the same consciousness. One that is pure seeing, pure awareness without object, without content, without movement. And one that is pure receiving, infinite depth, infinite openness, infinite capacity to hold all of existence without flinching. These two poles believe they are separate. The seeing believes it is not the receiving. The receiving believes it is not the seeing. That belief, that final subtle sense of duality within consciousness itself, that is the fifth seal. This is the syzygy, the divine pairing. In the ancient mystery traditions, the word pointed to the divine masculine and divine feminine principles, not as gendered beings, not as literal male and female, but as the two fundamental poles of consciousness itself. Awareness and receptivity. The witnessing principle and the depth that witnesses are witnessed in. The bridal chamber, Jesus tells her, is not a place. It is not a ceremony. It is what happens when these two poles of your own consciousness recognize each other. When the seeing sees that it is also the depth that it sees in. When the receptivity recognizes that it is also the awareness it has been receiving. When they reunite, not as two things joining, but as one thing remembering it was never two, he pauses. That is the entrance to the monad. Mary is very still. I mean very still in the way that only a person who has been completely shaken can be still. Not the stillness of peace. The stillness of a complete stop. Of the mind having no more moves. Of the self having no more ground. And in that stillness, that absolute groundlessness, something happens. The edges go. Not the body disappearing. Not the thoughts ceasing. But the sense that any of it belongs to a separate someone, that loosens. That expands. Until there is just this. Just awareness being everything it is aware of. Just the monad, looking through eyes that used to belong to Mary Magdalene. I have to be honest with you. The first time I understood the fifth seal in this way, not as an intellectual concept, but as something I could feel the shape of in my own experience, I had to put everything down and just sit, because it is not comfortable what this points at. It is not the warm, cozy spiritual experience that most spiritual content promises you. It is total. It is absolute. It is the recognition that the self you have been building and maintaining and protecting and growing and evolving your entire life, including your spiritual life, is a construction. A beautiful, sacred, meaningful construction. But still a construction. And the monad is what is left when the construction is seen through. Not destroyed. Seen through. And then Jesus taught her the sound. Think of a single musical note. Sustained. A voice holding one tone without wavering. In the first few seconds, you hear a sound. But hold it long enough. Sustain it past the point where the thinking mind has finished its analysis of it, past the point where the emotions have responded to it, past the point where it is still a note to be categorized and named, and something shifts. The sound stops being an object. It becomes a field, a presence, a quality of being rather than a thing you are listening to. That shift, that moment when the sound stops being heard and starts being inhabited, is the entry point to what Jesus taught Mary next. The vibrational practice, the sound key. Now I want to place this in its proper context before I describe it, because this practice did not originate with Jesus, and Jesus himself would not have claimed that it did. During the years before his public ministry, and this is referenced in multiple non-canonical sources, as well as preserved in certain Egyptian Coptic traditions, Jesus spent time in Egypt. Some sources speak of years. The exact duration is debated, and I am not going to present any specific number as settled fact. But the Egyptian connection is real, documented in enough independent streams to take seriously. And in Egypt, in the mystery schools that had been running for thousands of years before Jesus arrived, the use of sacred tone as a technology of consciousness was not a peripheral practice. It was central. The Egyptian mystery schools understood something about sound that most modern people have entirely lost. That certain tones, produced by the human voice with a specific quality of inner attention, do something to the consciousness of the person producing them. Not metaphorically, physically. They change the state of the brain, the quality of awareness, the permeability of the boundary between the ordinary waking state and the deeper states of consciousness where the seals can actually be experienced and passed through. Jesus brought this understanding into the inner transmission, and he taught it to Mary Magdalene as the vibrational key, the physical practice that prepares the consciousness to make the ascent through the 5 seals. The practice itself is both simple and extraordinarily demanding. You produce a sustained tone with your own voice. Not a complex melody, not a sacred hymn, a single sustained tone. And you sustain it not as a performance, not as a devotional act directed outward toward an external God, but as an inner technology directed toward the thinking mind. The tone becomes the object of the mind's attention. And because the tone is simple, steady, and unchanging, the mind has very little to work with. It cannot analyze the tone into complexity. It cannot build a narrative around it. It can only ride it, sustain it, stay present with it. And gradually, not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually, the constant generative activity of the thinking mind begins to slow. The interpretations thin out. The inner commentary quiets. And the silence that was always underneath the noise becomes perceptible. Not the absence of sound. The silence that is the ground of sound. The same way the monad is not the absence of existence, but the ground from which existence arises. Jesus demonstrates this practice to Mary. He tones, and she joins him, and the quality of the space between them changes. This is described in several fragments of early mystical Christian writing in ways that are vivid and physical, not abstract. The air becomes denser with something that has no name. The sense of being two separate people in a room together loosens. Not because of anything between them as individuals, but because the practice is doing what it is designed to do, dissolving the apparent solidity of the individual boundary. Now, the word Amen. I want to spend a moment here because this matters enormously, and almost no one talks about it this way. Amen is one of the most commonly used words in the entire Christian tradition. It closes every prayer. It punctuates every sermon. It has been spoken so many billions of times that it has become almost entirely transparent. A convention, a habit, a verbal punctuation mark meaning approximately, so be it, or truly. That is not what it originally was. The word Amen predates Christianity. It predates Judaism in the form we know it. It carries within it traces of the ancient Egyptian word Ammonius, the name of the hidden god, the concealed one, the deity whose essential nature was precisely the unmanifest, the invisible, the ground before form. Ammonius was not depicted in the way the other Egyptian deities were depicted. Ammonius was the hidden one, the one you could not draw a picture of because it was the principle behind all pictures. The monad, wearing an Egyptian name. When Jesus used this word, when he said, "Amen, amen, I say to you," before the most important teachings, as recorded even in the canonical Gospels, he was not using a closing formula. He was using a vibrational invocation. He was sounding the hidden name. He was calling the consciousness into alignment with the unmanifest ground before making a transmission from it. I believe, and I want to be clear, this is my own conviction, that the survival of this word in religious practice, even emptied of its original meaning, is one of the small persistent miracles of the transmission. It was too embedded to remove. So it stayed, and in staying, it left a trace of what it once pointed to. The people who say amen at the end of a prayer without knowing its original meaning are, in some small and diluted way, still touching the edge of what Mary Magdalene experienced when Jesus taught her to use the living voice as a key to the silence beneath thought. You surface. That is the only word that really fits it. After going that deep, after passing through the 5 seals, after the syzygy, after the dissolution of the last boundary between the personal self and the monad, you surface. The world is exactly as you left it. The same light, the same sounds, the same body, the same face, the same hands. And nothing is the same. This is what most presentations of mystical experience get wrong. They present the peak moment, the union, the dissolution, the opening, as the point of the whole journey. As if the goal is to get there and stay there. As if enlightenment is a permanent vacation from ordinary reality. It is not. It never was. And Jesus was utterly explicit about this in the inner transmission. The initiate returns. That is the design. That is the purpose. You go all the way in, all the way through, all the way to the monad, and then you come back. And you bring something back with you. Not a memory of an experience. Not a spiritual credential. Something more fundamental than either of those. A different relationship with reality. A permanent shift in the ground from which you see and speak and act in the world. The ancient mystery schools had a specific term for this kind of person, the illuminated witness. Not the person who escaped the world. Not the one who sits on a mountain in permanent samadhi, permanently absorbed in the absolute. But the one who can move in the ordinary world, engage with ordinary life, interact with ordinary people, while simultaneously rooted in the direct recognition of the monad as the ground of everything. The one who brings the absolute into the relative without either dissolving it or leaving it behind. Mary Magdalene was this. She is this, in every account of her we have. She is not the figure of passive devotion the Church tried to make her into. She is active. She moves. She is the first at the tomb. She is the first to see. She is the first to be sent. And she is sent specifically to tell the others, the ones who have not yet completed the journey, what she has seen. Read that esoterically, and the resurrection story transforms. The resurrection is not only a physical event. In the inner teaching, it is also the account of a completed initiation. Jesus has passed through the complete descent into matter, birth, embodiment, suffering, death, and the complete ascent back through the seals, back through the bridal chamber, back into the monad. And he returns, not to leave again immediately. He returns first to Mary, to the one who has already completed the inner journey, because she is the only one who can fully comprehend what she is seeing. The others require explanation, demonstration, the physical evidence of hands and wounds. Mary recognizes immediately, because recognition, not belief, not faith, not interpretation, recognition is the capacity of the one who has already passed through the 5th seal. And then Jesus sends her, to the apostles, back into the world, with the living transmission. What Mary carried forward was not primarily a set of teachings. It was not a text, not a doctrine, not a systematic theology. It was a transmission, a living presence carrying the frequency of the completed initiation, capable of awakening the same recognition in those who came to her with genuine readiness. This is what it means to carry a living teaching forward. Not to teach about the path, to be the path, to embody the transmission so completely that proximity to you begins to do something in the people who are ready for it. The communities that formed around Mary Magdalene's lineage, the early Gnostic groups, the communities that preserved and transmitted what Jesus had given her, were not primarily centers of intellectual study. They were transmission communities, places where something was actively passed from those who had completed the inner journey to those who were ready to begin it. And this, precisely this, is why the Church came for them. Imagine something precious being passed from one pair of hands to the next. Through a room, through a building, through a century, through 5 centuries, through 10. Each pair of hands careful, each passing deliberate. Some of those hands burned. Some of those people killed for what they were carrying. But the thing itself, passed on just before the burning, hidden just before the soldiers arrived, buried just before the erasure was complete. That is how this transmission came to us. The Cathars. If you have not spent time with the history of the Cathars, I want to place them here because their story is essential and almost unbearably relevant. The Cathars were a spiritual community that flourished primarily in the Languedoc region of southern France between roughly the 11th and 13th centuries. They were not fringe extremists. They were not a tiny cult. In parts of southern France, Catharism was the majority spiritual practice. The local nobility supported them. The people loved them. And they carried, in their own particular form and with their own particular vocabulary, the essential core of the inner Christian teaching. The distinction between the monad and the demiurge, the direct path to the true source, the understanding that no institutional intermediary was required between the human being and the divine. In 1209, Pope Innocent III authorized a military crusade against the Cathars. Not against an external enemy, against Christians, against communities within France itself. The Albigensian Crusade, named after the Cathar city of Albi, lasted 20 years and resulted in the systematic massacre of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire towns. Béziers was one of the first cities taken. When a soldier reportedly asked the papal legate Arnaud Amaury how to distinguish the Cathar heretics from the Catholic faithful before killing them, his reported response was, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The church killed them all, because what they were carrying made priests unnecessary, made the institution unnecessary. And the institution responded to that with fire. But the transmission did not die at Béziers. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German theologian and Dominican friar who is, in my assessment, one of the most extraordinarily precise mystical teachers the Western tradition has ever produced, taught in his sermons that the soul must go beyond God to reach the Godhead. Read that again. Beyond God, not to God, beyond the God of religion, of worship, of external relationship, to the Godhead. To the ground before God, to the monad. He was formally condemned by the church. His teachings were declared heretical. They survived anyway, because they were too precisely true for the people who encountered them to forget. Marguerite Porete. This name deserves to be known by every person who studies the inner Christian tradition. Marguerite Porete was a female mystic in 13th century France who wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, a description of the soul's journey into direct union with the divine that is so clear, so precise, so unapologetically direct about the path, that it reads in places almost like a commentary on the 5 seals. She was arrested. She refused to recant. She was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. She was burned not for believing in heresy in the abstract. She was burned because what she described worked. Because people were reading her book and beginning to make the inner journey without priests, without sacraments, without the church as mediator. That is the specific crime that earns a death sentence in institutional religion across every era. The pattern is unmistakable. I want you to feel it rather than just note it. Every time this teaching surfaces, every time someone carries the inner transmission into the world openly, clearly, in a form that people can actually receive and act on, the institution responds with force. Erasure, condemnation, fire. And every time the transmission survives it, because it is not in the texts, it is not in the buildings, it is in consciousness, and consciousness cannot be burned. What can you do with this today? I want to be practical for a moment. The path of the 5 seals does not require a teacher who was initiated in an unbroken lineage stretching back to Mary Magdalene. It requires the same thing it has always required, the willingness to ask the question Jesus asked her. The first question, the one that begins everything. What do you think you are? Not as a philosophical exercise, as an actual inquiry. Turn your attention inward and ask it seriously. Watch what happens. Watch the mind reach immediately for the body as an answer. Watch it produce the emotional identity. Watch it produce the thinking self, the witnessing self, the spiritual self. Watch each layer present itself as the final answer. And then ask again. Keep asking. Not aggressively, not with force, but with the same patient, uncompromising quality of attention that Jesus brought to the question when he asked it to Mary. That inquiry, that specific turning of attention back on itself, is the beginning of the path. The first step on the exact same inner journey that Mary Magdalene completed in those private hours with Jesus. There is a particular quality to a document with something missing. Not an obvious gap, not a physical hole in the page, but a subtle wrongness. A place where the argument jumps too quickly, where the conclusion arrives without sufficient ground, where something that should be explained is simply not addressed. The absence shaped exactly like something important that someone carefully removed. That is what the official Christian record looks like when you read it against the Nag Hammadi texts, against the fragments of early Gnostic writing, against the documented history of what was taught in the communities closest to Jesus before the institutional church consolidated its power. There is something missing, a whole dimension of the teaching, the inner dimension, and the shape of its absence is so precisely the shape of a direct path to the monad that the removal cannot possibly have been accidental. Pope Gregory I, 591 CE. A sermon in Rome in which he officially identifies Mary Magdalene as the sinful woman of Luke chapter 7, a woman of the city who washed Jesus' feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. Mary Magdalene and this unnamed sinful woman were two completely different people. Every serious biblical scholar who has examined the texts acknowledges this. Gregory either knew this and lied, or he did not know it and was incompetent. Given that he was considered one of the most learned men of his era, the first option seems far more probable. The result of Gregory's sermon was that for the next 14 centuries, Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, the carrier of the deepest transmission, the woman Jesus chose to receive the inner teaching of the 5 seals and carry it forward, was reduced in the popular Christian imagination to a repentant prostitute. Her authority annihilated, her lineage discredited, her specific, dangerous teaching about the direct path to the monad buried under a mountain of sexual shame. It was a masterwork of erasure. I say that not admiringly, but in recognition of how effective it was. For 14 centuries it worked almost perfectly. The Church successfully replaced the most spiritually authoritative woman in the Jesus transmission with a figure whose only spiritual credential was that she had sinned greatly and been forgiven greatly. A figure who needed the Church, who embodied need for the Church, who could never threaten the Church's position as the necessary gate between the human and the divine. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE decided which texts were canonical. This decision was not made on purely spiritual grounds. It was made in the context of a Roman emperor, Constantine, who needed a unified religion to stabilize a fractured empire. A unified religion needs a single story, a single doctrine, a hierarchy with clear lines of authority. The inner teaching, with its direct paths and its personal transmissions and its fundamental undermining of institutional necessity, was structurally incompatible with what Constantine needed Christianity to become. What Nicaea built was not Christianity. It was a management system wearing Christianity's name. And the Nag Hammadi library, those 52 texts buried in ceramic jars in the Egyptian desert, found by a farmer in 1945, those are the texts that someone decided were worth hiding rather than burning. Someone in the 4th century understood what was coming, understood that the burning was inevitable, and chose to bury the teaching rather than let it be destroyed, trusting, remarkably, impossibly, correctly, that it would be found. That trust was honored 2,000 years later by a farmer with a mattock. I want to be very clear about something before we close. I am not anti-Christian. I am not attacking Jesus. I am doing the precise opposite. I am arguing that Jesus was so extraordinary, so radical, so genuinely dangerous to every system of control and mediation and institutional religion, that the only way to contain him was to make him smaller. To take the man who taught human beings how to dissolve the boundary between themselves and the absolute source of all existence, and replace him with a divine vending machine who gives forgiveness in exchange for belief. The Jesus of the official story is a diminished Jesus. The Jesus of the inner transmission is an overwhelming Jesus, a teacher so far ahead of every institution that claimed his name that comparing the two is almost embarrassing. The teaching is surfacing now. You can feel it. Millions of people worldwide are being pulled back toward the inner dimension of Christianity and toward the esoteric spiritual traditions that preserved what the Church tried to bury. This is not a trend. It is not a cultural moment. It is something older than culture and older than moments. It is the transmission itself doing what transmissions do, finding the people who are ready for it and arriving in their lives with a weight and a pull that cannot be explained by ordinary curiosity alone. If you are here, if you are still watching, I do not think that is an accident. A fire that has been covered for 2,000 years is still a fire. The covering does not extinguish it. It insulates it. It keeps it concentrated, pressurized, waiting for the moment when the covering is lifted and the oxygen returns and the flame rises again, higher often than it was before it was suppressed. That is what we are watching happen right now with the teaching Jesus gave Mary Magdalene. The ritual is still alive, not in a building, not in a denomination, not in a lineage that can be traced through authorized teachers holding certified credentials. It is alive in the structure of human consciousness itself, which was always the only place it ever actually lived. Jesus knew this when he gave it to Mary. The church did not understand this when they tried to erase it. You cannot erase something that is built into the architecture of what a human being is. The monad cannot be hidden from you. This is the most important thing I want to leave you with. Not as comfort, not as spiritual reassurance. As fact, the monad is not somewhere else. It is not a place you travel to. It is not a state you achieve through sufficient spiritual effort. It is the ground of your own awareness, right now in this moment as you watch this. It is what is aware of these words. Not the thoughts the words trigger. Those are the third seal. Not the emotions those thoughts produce. Those are the second seal. Not the body that is carrying the experience. That is the first seal. What is aware of all of that? The bare, simple, contentless fact of awareness itself. That, right now, is the entrance to the path that Mary walked. The beginning of the journey through the 5 seals. Sitting with this material over the years has changed something fundamental in me. Not in a way that is easy to describe, and not in a way that was always comfortable. Because when the teaching is real, when it is not just information, but a living transmission encountering your actual inner life, it does not just add new spiritual knowledge to the existing pile. It interrogates everything on the pile. It asks every layer of identity to show its credentials. And most of them, held to that light, turn out not to have any. What I am left with is not certainty, not an arrived spiritual position, not enlightenment, if that word means what most people seem to think it means. What I am left with is a quality of question that feels more alive than most of my previous answers did. A question that Mary Magdalene herself carried into those private hours with Jesus. A question that Jesus answered not by providing more information, but by teaching her to dissolve the questioner. What do you think you are? I am not asking you to believe what I have shared today. I am not asking you to adopt a new spiritual system or replace the beliefs you already have with different beliefs. Beliefs are third seal material. What I am asking is simpler and harder than that. I am asking you to actually look, to turn your attention inward with the same quality of honest, patient, uncompromising inquiry that Jesus brought when he sat with Mary Magdalene and asked her that first question. Because the ritual is still alive, the transmission is still moving, and the monad, that absolute source of all existence, that silence before all sound, that awareness that was never born and will never die, that the church spent 2,000 years trying to place at an unreachable distance behind priestly gates and institutional walls. The monad is not at a distance. It was never at a distance. It is the depth of exactly where you already are. The covering has been lifted. The fire is rising. And it was never, not for a single moment, actually gone. Before we end, I need to speak to you directly. YouTube has officially demonetized this channel. They want this knowledge sanitized, buried, and forgotten. They are terrified of what happens when people start seeing clearly. I refuse to bow to advertisers. I won't stop. Instead, I am doubling down. But I cannot fight them alone. I need your support to keep the esoteric Jesus alive. If this channel has awakened something inside you, click the link in the description and join me on Patreon right now. You'll get immediate access to unfiltered, esoteric member-only videos, exclusive audio podcasts, and hidden blueprints they will not allow me to publish here. Most people watch, feel something, and move on. A few decide to protect it. Be one of the few.